Look, I guess the starting point in this meeting is that the discussion we're having today is by no means an academic one. I'm very proud that I've done a slideshow, like a lecturer, but it's not like this is an academic discussion where we put people in boxes or we put labels on different groups just for the hell of it, just to explore it. The reason we're having this meeting is to understand what fascism is, why the far right are on the rise, so that we can stop them, so that we can build a mass movement that can stop them and destroy fascism and the far right. And the urgency of that task was brought home by the elections that happened in the Spanish state on the weekend. People would have seen that Vox, far right, anti-migrant, anti-Muslim, anti-feminist, anti-Catalan independence, a nasty right-wing party, surged really from nowhere to come third place in the Spanish elections and take 15% of the vote. It's chilling to see how quickly they've climbed the electoral ladder. And what Vox's victory means is that the pattern, the norm now, around the whole of Europe, is that fascist or far-right parties are finishing third, second, or in some places first in elections. This is a map from the BBC. It's from a couple of weeks ago, so it doesn't include the results of the Spanish elections. But if you add Spain to that list, you see that now the norm in Europe is to have far-right and fascist parties getting huge percentages of the vote. I mean, look at Austria, 26%. Jobbik in Hungary, 19%. Switzerland, 29%. And you see, if we had been having this meeting 4 or 5 years ago, we would have been talking about the so-called edges of Europe, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and so on. But now, the very centre of liberal Europe is infected by the disease of fascism and the far right. Think about France, the Front National. This is the most recent elections, but in the last presidential election in 2017, Marine Le Pen came second. It's very likely, I think, that with Macron not delivering, that Marine Le Pen will think she's in with a chance of being the next president of France. The Front National come from fascist roots. They come from the apologists of the Nazi regime in the 1940s and 1930s. Look at Germany. On my holidays, I went to Berlin in the summer. And as I went to Berlin, I went to visit Sachsenhausen concentration camp. At Sachsenhausen, 500,000 people were killed by the Nazi regime. Jews, communists, LGBT people and so on. And obviously all the stuff you see at Sachsenhausen is harrowing. The most harrowing thing though, the most terrifying thing, is that as you walk up to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, on the road leading up to it, on the lampposts are election posters for Alternative for Deutschland. Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, are a far-right party with neo-Nazis at their heart, anti-Semites, Islamophobes. In the country 70 years on, where the Holocaust took place, you now have open Nazis as part of a party that is the official opposition in the German parliament. They came third in the last national elections. So clearly, the situation, I think, is where across Europe you're seeing a general growth for the far right, and actually you're seeing wider than that as well. Think about Modi in Italy or Bolsonaro in Brazil. The general trend is that we're seeing a polarisation in society, and the far right are profiting very much from that. And one thing that I think is quite important, right, is to recognise that not all of the examples or not all of the things that I just talked about, they're not all the same thing, right? There's a lot of different, I think, elements on the far right. And actually what characterises the current period is that while you have different groups on the far right, they are often cross-fertilising. They are working with each other in different formations. But there's 4 main groups I think it's important to get our heads around about what we see on the far right. The first group are what could be classed as classical fascists. These are organisations like Golden Dawn in Greece. You can see they don't hide their fascism. They display it quite obviously. The Golden Dawn swastika the Golden Dawn logo in Greece is a Greek swastika. These are open fascist organisations. To be honest, they're not that different from the 1930s and 40s. And it's terrifying. At one point, Golden Dawn were on 9 or 10% in the polls, but they've been beaten back. The second group I think you see on the far right is what is known as Eurofascism. These are people like the Front National, like Marine Le Pen. They like to pretend that they're just normal mainstream conservative parties. Marine Le Pen poses as, you can see she says I'm a party of the French Republic. They like to say that they've shed their fascist past, that they've got rid of the anti-Semitism or the Islamophobia and so on. The reality, I think, is different. I don't think we should take Marine Le Pen on her words. They're pursuing an electoral strategy at the moment, but at their core, they still have the fascist thugs and ideologues who have dominated them in the past. The third group I want to look at is what is known as racist populism. I think Nigel Farage probably embodies this the best. I don't think Nigel Farage is a fascist. I do think he's a racist populist, though. In other words, he uses racism towards migrants, right-wing ideology to gain votes, but he really has an electoral strategy. He's not building a fascist core in the Brexit Party, and he wasn't doing the same in UKIP. In actual fact, he distanced himself from more fascist elements. And you see people like Nigel Farage or Geert Wilders in Holland, or people like Bolsonaro, I think, in Brazil, who quite quickly can pose as an outsider and see themselves climb in the polls. The fourth group, and the final group I want to look at, is what are calling themselves the alt-right. These are people around Steve Bannon in the States, Richard Spencer, people will have heard of, and here in Britain, the Generation Identity, who have changed their name recently, I think, to the Identitarian Movement, or people might know. I think that they've changed their name and changed their logo. The aim of the alt-right is not to build a street movement like Tommy Robinson, like the English Defence League. They have a more sophisticated project. They're really trying to build a sophisticated cadre, a more ideological middle-class layer who are wedded to far-right and fascist ideas. So Generation Identity build on university campuses. In Britain, we've seen them appear on a few. The alt-right in the States are focusing on the universities. They try and use pseudo-racist arguments, fake sort of science arguments to justify racism, far-right ideas, and so on. And I think it's important to say, right, that you have these four different groups that I've just outlined, and there's different formations on the far right. But what characterises a period is that it's not like you can just rigidly put them in boxes. Actually, they're working with each other in lots of different groups, and there's a state of flux. Organisations change as they pursue different strategies. So think about a group like UKIP. When Nigel Farage was leader of UKIP, I would say that it pursued a solely electoral strategy. UKIP's aim was to get votes, right? And actually, during that time, Nigel Farage would not associate with the far right or the fascist right. You couldn't become a member of UKIP if you'd been in the BNP, the British National Party, or the EDL, the English Defence League. Tommy Robinson was, Farage would not associate with people like that. And, you've got to remember, it was only 2015 that they won 4 million votes in the British general election. Right? So they had an electoral strategy. Look at how UKIP changed over the following years. The ex-leader, Gerard Bratton, openly pursued Tommy Robinson. Openly wanted to form an alliance with the street movements. They called demonstrations. Now UKIP is in trouble, and it's, we're thankful for that. But you can see that over the years, its strategy changed. It was a racist populist party. It then started to work with fascists. Another example is the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD in Germany. When the AfD started in 2013, they were really a Eurosceptic party. They brought elements of conservatives, respectable politicians and so on in the 6 years since then, the fascist wing has grown more prominent and has called demonstrations and has made some of the running. So I guess the point is we've got these 4 different groups, right? But often it's quite difficult to characterise people. It's not about putting labels on people. It's just to understand the different formations that exist. I think one thing we have to do, though, is we have to be clear about a definition of what fascism is. Because you see, fascism is not just the nastiest, most homophobic, most racist, most anti-Semitic people you can think of. Of course, most fascists are all of those things, right? But that's not what makes them fascist. It's possible to be those things and not be a fascist. At its heart, fascism is a unique project. It's a unique ideology and it's a unique movement. And really, at its heart, fascism aims not just to oppress minorities, not just to persecute Jews and Muslims and so on. At its heart, fascism is a movement to smash all working class organisation and to actually smash parliamentary democracy. And you see, the way that Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary Trotsky, wrote a book on fascism, is he said that the way that fascism does this, the way that fascism smashes all parliamentary democracy, is through 2 things. It has a street wing and it has a parliamentary wing. And the street wing is full of thugs, boot boys, stormtroopers, who literally go around smashing up opposition. Smashing up Jewish shops in the 1930s. The EDL who rampaged through Muslim areas in Stoke in 2008 and so on. So it has a street wing which smashes opposition and creates terror, right? But it also has to use a parliamentary wing as well. Fascism isn't just a street project. It also has a parliamentary wing. It seeks to win elections. It seeks to have a respectable face. It seeks to convince the ruling class that it can be a respectable mainstream party. And depending on the period, sometimes fascists will focus on the street wing and sometimes they'll focus electorally. But nonetheless, just because of each of those wings that it chooses doesn't mean that it stopped being a fascist. Marine Le Pen is focusing on the electoral wing. The Front National still have a big internal security force of thousands of people who are stormtroopers and will go around and do the bidding of Le Pen if they're called on. And the reason why I think this definition is important, right, is because it's clear then that not everyone on the right fits that definition. So think about Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is a very nasty person. I don't need to tell you that. He's a racist. He's a sexist. Islamophobe. I don't think he's a fascist, though. Johnson is pursuing a parliamentary strategy to do what he wants to do, to bring in a right-wing government, right? He's not pursuing a street strategy. Boris Johnson is not building up a street army of thugs. He can give confidence to fascists, but nevertheless, that's not his project. And I'm not trying to say that Johnson's not a danger, right? He is. The hostile environment of, calling Muslim women letterboxes. He's a big danger, but clearly he is different from someone like Golden Dawn or Tommy Robinson. And the reason it's important to grasp that is that different groups require different strategies. The tactics that were used to stop Tommy Robinson or that our Greek comrades used to fight Golden Dawn are different from the strategies we'd use to oppose Boris Johnson. So I think it's important to put that out there, and I'll be interested to see what people think about that. The question I then want to move on to is, how have we got to this position? How is it, like I said, that in a country, 70 years on from the Holocaust and the horrors that came with Auschwitz, how is it that the far right are on the rise again? How is it that, the political situation around Europe, yes, sees forces of the left on the rise, like Corbyn, Bernie Sanders in the States and so on, but how is it that we've come almost full circle, really, in the fact that the far right are on the biggest and most strongest level since the 1930s? And you see, clearly, it can't be divorced from the financial crash in 2008. Because since 2008, you've seen a rapid acceleration of far-right parties. That graph that I showed, most of those parties have taken big leaps forward since the 2008 crash. And you see, of course, on one level, right, an attack on living standards, austerity, low wages, cuts to public services, all the stuff that's happened since 2008 to make us pay for the crisis, of course, right, you can say that that will lead to a rise in racism and a rise on the far right. But you see, we also can't be too simplistic about it, because actually we know that those kind of conditions can also lead to a rise of the left, of Corbyn, Sanders, the global revolts we're seeing at the moment, and so on. I think we have to look at a more sophisticated analysis of how it is that the far right have come to be at such a position of strength. And you see, I think we have to start by looking at the response of mainstream parties to the financial crisis. You know, conservative parties, the grand old parties that have dominated democracies in Europe and so on for so long. I think we have to understand their role in leading to the rise of the far right. Because you see, the financial crash of 2008 really was a crisis of neoliberalism. The mainstream economics that has dominated for the last 30, 40 years, you know, Thatcher, Reagan, you know, trickle-down economics, the 1%, the rule of the free market and so on, all the mainstream parties for the last 30, 40 years, including social democratic parties like the Labour Party, have signed up to that agenda. Think about Blairism. You know, all the mainstream parties have signed up to the idea that neoliberalism is a good thing, is progressive, that what's good for the 1% is good for us, that trickle-down economics. And you see, the 2008 crisis was a complete unravelling of that. It showed that that ideology was broken. Since then, it's clear that neoliberal capitalism does not deliver for the majority of population. And therefore, the ideology of all the mainstream parties has been thrown into crisis. You know, this is why we've seen the end of Blairism or Hillary Clinton in the States. You know, the people who signed up for that suddenly had a crisis of how do we shore up our base? We've signed up to this ideology. It's been proven to be bullshit. What do we do now? And one of the big responses from the mainstream parties, and especially conservative parties, is that to shore up their base, they've turned to a toxic mix of racism and hardcore Islamophobia. And actually, if you look at all the examples that I talked about, right, the biggest elements of racism in society have not come from fascists, have not come from the far right. Actually, it's been the mainstream traditional parties who have played the role in normalising racism and Islamophobia. So think about France. Who is it who has led the attacks on what Muslim women can wear, on the hijab, and on daily Islamophobia? It's actually been Nicolas Sarkozy, the Tory party in France. It's been François Hollande from the Socialist party, and now Macron, you know, a centrist. Now, of course, they've been trying to undermine the support for Le Pen, but nevertheless, they're the people who have brought in these racist ideas and racist policies. Think about Germany. Alternative for Deutschland didn't come from nowhere. For a while now, the mainstream Christian Democrat Union, Angela Merkel's party, and the Christian Social Union, the sister organisation, they're the ones who have been pushing the idea that Islam doesn't belong in Germany. It's one of their interior ministers, one of Merkel's close allies, who wrote a book saying Islam does not belong in Germany. Think about Austria, where you have the Fascist Freedom Party, who were enabled and encouraged by the Conservative Party, Sebastian Kurz, who stole a lot of their policies. Even think about here on a smaller scale, right? When Boris Johnson calls Muslim women letterboxes, he is giving a nod and a wink to the far right. He's normalising their language. And you add to this the position that the EU has taken on migrants, the drowning of migrants in the Mediterranean, you know, the borders and fortress Europe. What I'm trying to get at is that the isolation that fascist groups have been under since the Holocaust, you know, the isolation of we can't touch them, they're toxic, that's been beginning to break down. Because mainstream politicians are using Islamophobia, you know, because social democratic parties have gone along with the idea that migrants drive down wages, fascists have felt like the mainstream are talking their language. Their ideas have been normalised. The policies of the hostile environment has given the far right confidence. And you see, it's interesting, right? In the 1970s, when the National Front were growing in Britain, if they looked around the world, they would have felt like they were an isolated example. They wouldn't have taken courage from the political situation around the world. Mass strikes, the Portuguese Revolution, all of that kind of thing. If you're a fascist now, you look around the world and you feel like your side's on the rise. You look at Bolsonaro, you look at Trump, you look at all of you feel like you're on the rise. And therefore I think it's important to say, right, that partly the reason we see all of this is because the fascists have been able to pose not as an extreme, but have been able to pose as the logical conclusion of the debate around immigration, Islamophobia, and so on. So I think we have to be honest, right, that the far right are clearly in a position of strength. Now, I don't want to depress anyone, right? It can be quite a depressing meeting looking at all of these images, but clearly they're in a position of strength that we haven't seen in a long, long time. We have to be honest about their strength. We also, though, I think, we have to be honest about their weaknesses as well. Because you see, it's not true that we're in 1933. You know, it's nowhere in Europe is a fascist dictator on the verge of power. Even in Austria, right, where the fascists were in coalition government, it didn't mean that Austria was in a fascist regime or a fascist dictatorship. Because although they have a big electoral base, although the parliamentary wing, their fascists have a position of strength, actually nowhere have they been able to build a street army necessary to carry through their project. And you see, I think what we're seeing at the moment is Hitler's strategy in reverse. We're seeing the strategy that Hitler employed in the 1930s in reverse. Because you see, in the 1920s, Hitler originally built the Nazi Party purely as a stormtrooper organisation, purely on the streets. They didn't build an electoral wing. If you look at Hitler's writings in the 1920s, he's dismissive of elections. He says the Nazis won't stand in elections. And they purely build a street army of thugs who beat up communists, attack Jews, you know, all of that kind of thing. But you see, in 1923, Hitler tries to take power in the beer hall putsch in Munich. He attempts a coup, right? Purely through the street, not through elections. And he, quite quickly, the coup unravels. Really what happens is that the German ruling class see Hitler and they think, we don't want him to take power. It's too risky. We might agree with him beating up the left, but it's too risky. We don't want a street movement like that taking power. And so what Hitler does for the next 10 years is he continues the street movement, but he builds up an electoral wing. He gets the Nazi Party to stand in elections, to put on a respectable face, to focus on parliamentary politics as well. And you go from 1923 with a failed coup and Hitler, you know, arrested and all of that shit. 10 years later, Hitler not only has a stormtrooper army of 400,000, but he also gets 33% in the polls. So in other words, the two wings of fascism, the street army and the parliamentary wing, Hitler has both. And that's how he's able to take power and is appointed by the parliament. And you see, I think it's different today, right? Because although fascists are strong electorally, they've had to reverse the strategy. The horrors of the Holocaust have made it toxic to build an open street movement like that. So they've had to focus on parliament. And it's worrying how much success they're having. And they put on different suits and they say, look, we're normal politicians. But nowhere yet have they been able to build a street movement. And the reason for that is, yes, it's because of the horrors of the Holocaust and the fact that, you know, it's not toxic, but they are trying. Look what happened in Chemnitz. Look at the Front National's internal party, internal security force. They are trying to build a street movement. And one of the most important things is that everywhere they go, there has been a mass anti-racist and anti-fascist movement to oppose them. And people should read an article by one of our comrades in Austria in an International Socialism journal a couple issues ago. I think it's about 6 months ago. Because in Austria, right, I tell you what, the SWP in Austria, I think it's about 40 people, right? Probably about people in this room. Okay, there's only 40 of them. But an organisation that small has been able to build a mass anti-fascist movement that has played a key role in driving back the fascists. Everywhere the fascists in Austria march, people oppose them. They're labelled as Nazis. People deny them platforms. They deny them public space. And I think it's incredibly important then to use that analysis of fascism to understand why they're on the rise, but crucially to build a broad anti-racist movement, a united front that brings together revolutionaries, reformists, people of no politics, together to try and drive the far right back. And I think within that as well, we have to have an analysis that with capitalism you have racism, and it's only once we get rid of the system that gives rise to the far right can we kick them out, but also build a world where fascism and racism are banished for good. And I'll leave it there.